They called her just Sarah, when the saloon door swung and the wind took the thin smoke of match and candle. When plates clinked and men leaned back in chairs with six-day stubble and old bargains on their tongues. She wore her hair in a thick braid down her back, a ribbon the color of a bruise tied at the end. She moved with the sort of quiet that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive, like the evening after a long noon. Men made room for her carriage when she passed, not out of respect so much as habit. Women smoothed skirts and steered daughters to look away. Children watched the way her hands folded a napkin or set a mug on a counter. Sarah moved with the ease of someone used to being watched and not observed. The town of Dry Creek crouched along a dull river that remembered thunder and sometimes gave color back. It had a single main street, a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon that smelled like old whiskey and lemon peel. The saloon's floorboards had been set down by men who'd later left town with pockets full of hopeful coins and the memory of a laughter fay the piano woman sold for whiskey. Beyond the town the land rolled off into the prairie, the grass uneven and nervous, dotted with stands of scrub and the occasional stubborn juniper. The sky was a wide lid of light that could drown a man or lift him, depending on the day. Sarah had come to Dry Creek from the north, traveling with her sister and a man called Thomas, who had been easy to look at and quick with a promise. Thomas liked the idea of a house with a porch swing and a wife who could set a table. He could swallow the land like a map and not feel the edges. He had called Sarah by a name she hadn't been given but had learned to answer out of the way a child takes a hand when the night is cold. When the fever took her sister and then Thomas, the town had decided a woman alone is less burden than a man left without a hand. They said the wrong things and left them unsaid. The arrival of sickness tightened the town's throat and the fever took more than lungs. It took the map Thomas had promised and the name Sarah was trying to make for herself. That was how she came to be the one who scrubbed the saloon floor at midnight, who boiled coffee at a stove that complained, who mended the frayed seams of ranchmen's coats when they preferred not to pay. She wore a work-worn dress that showed the shape of her shoulders but not the name on her heart. When people said she was quiet they meant it like a brick thrown at a window, and when a man lifted his hat as he passed, they meant it the way someone lifts a thought to the surface and doesn't answer. Sarah was Apache by blood on her mother's side, a fact she bore like a hidden locket. She had come to carry both names, one given by her grandmother and another pressed on her by chance and grief, but in Dry Creek those names were footnotes. She was more often just the woman who kept the pots hot and the pies coming. The town had a grammar to its cruelty. It operated on small humiliations. The preacher's wife complaining about a muddied hem that might have belonged to a street brat, the land-rich merchant who gave her half a tip as though charity were a sermon, the schoolteacher who tooted at her accent and named it exotic instead of human. These actions pressed into Sarah like a weight she did not step away from. She carried them in the quiet between one dish clink and the next. She had learned to meet offense with a stillness so precise it felt like prayer. Her eyes were steady, dark as river stone. When she smiled, and it was not often, it was quick and precise, like a sun burst through a corner of cloud. Her hands were calloused in a way that spoke of many small kindnesses and hard labors. The palms softened from holding an infant, the knuckles creased from beating dough, the fingertips marked with the ink of ledger corrections. People saw the hands and had opinions. Men in the saloon told jokes they presumed would tug those hands and bring laughter. Women whispered, sometimes in envious tones, sometimes in wary ones. But Sarah kept her head high and moved like the moon risen on a borrowed bit of land. There, unannounced, steady. He saw her the first time he stepped into the saloon with the look of a man who had left something behind in his own life and come to find it among the strangers. He was a miner named Jacob Hale, though the town shortened it to Jake before his hat took shape on his knee and his boots earned a scuff. He rode in from the south with dust in his hair and a wagon that carried the soft promise of change. He had eyes like someone who'd seen black nights and a sun that had not always felt kind. Those eyes watched the room and then settled on Sarah like someone who had learned maps could be read by the shape of a person. Jake was of a kind that lasted in the mouth of a storm. Broad, direct, with a jaw that didn't bother to be polite. His past lay buried in pockets he did not open. When a man keeps his past close, it is never because the past is small. It filled his hands with muscle and his stride with the ease of a man who had once swung a pick until the mountains answered. He had been to places where lawless maps were made and remade, where faces blurred together and a man learned the value of silence. In his wagon he carried tools, a chest with a lock he never pried open, and an old photograph folded thin that he sometimes took out and looked at when the night was very quiet. He had come to Dry Creek with an ache that had no name and a hope that something steady might stitch him back together. He spoke little the first night he came into the saloon. He ordered coffee, and the woman behind the bar, Ellen, who kept a ledger of grudges and a drawer of secrets, set a mug in front of him with a tilt of wood-worn hands. Sarah worked behind Ellen, arranging sugar and listening as she always did when a man's story wanted to take up room. Jake's hands were heavy on the mug. He didn't ask questions. He watched Sarah move. It was the way she refilled a pot, the way the steam softened the line of her cheek, the small cloud that rose and left her face again untouched. Something in that made him look away and look again, like a man reading a line in a ledger and finding unexpected profit. He had the sort of curiosity that is patient. He observed, then decided to let observation become a habit. "You're the quiet kind," he said to her once, when the saloon was a river of low voices and a poker table argued with fate. "Some of us prefer doing," she answered simply, not looking up from the cloth she was folding. It was the kind of line that could tilt a conversation either way, toward a fight or a quiet, the sort she used precisely when words could bring trouble. Jake liked that. He liked that she didn't make a place for talk where talk didn't belong. He liked that she took the world by its seams and fixed what unraveled without fanfare. He started leaving half a cup of coffee at her corner, small tokens like breadcrumbs. He would take his mug to the table by the window and sip while watching her, and slowly his presence became a part of the saloon's geography. People talked about him. Small towns always do. He'd been seen laughing at a wayward gambler on the street, or pinching the child of the grocer in a manner that suggested goodwill, and gossip called it bravado. But the truth was quieter. He was there for a reason he had not yet named. Sarah noticed the crumbs he left. She saw the way he guarded his expression when men's voices rose into something rough and cruel, the way he measured his words before letting them out. She recognized pain under the skin of that measure. That recognition made her hands still, made the cloth cool in the air. She had a small soft place inside where the hunger for nicety and rightness lived. This was a space that the town treated roughly but which still had room for something like compassion. She poured her kindness out in the way that country folk measure out cake. One careful scoop at a time, no hurry, no fuss. One night a boy came into the saloon, no older than 14, with cheeks scraped and a hunger that had a sour tang. He needed coin, and a man at the table had promised him coin if he would fetch the liquor. The man's voice was fat with the smell of old bottles, and he chuckled at the boy like a man who kept wolves as pets. The boy's hands shook when the bottle hit his palm. He looked at it as if it were both salvation and a curse. "You bring that in here," the man said. "You're on your own for what you do. We don't baby thieves and we don't feed liars." The boy looked around for help, but the room was a net of shoulders and hats. Sarah saw him and, without a word, wiped her hands and went to the back. She filled a pie tin from the cooler with warm bread and set a mug of coffee at the boy's table when he wasn't looking. He watched her with the reverence of someone who has learned to worship any hand that doesn't condemn him. The man at the table huffed and said that was the sort of thing that kept a town soft. But the boy ate, and for the first time in weeks his chewing was not frantic. He asked nothing and said less, but when he left the saloon his shoulders were less drawn in. Jake watched from across the room. The corner of his mouth tightened in something like a frown and something like approval. He'd been to towns where cruelty passed for humor and where the good were left to dry like meat in the sun. Watching Sarah move was like reading a phrase that made sense of a bigger sentence. He felt a stirring he had not expected. He stepped outside once the boy had left and followed the sound of shoes on dirt until he caught the outline of the boy's shoulders as he hurried down the lane. "You okay?" Jake asked. The boy nodded, too shy to say more. Jake handed him some coin and a wordless nod. The boy nearly cried then, and Jake left him with a look that said, "You can be small and still be enough." "You didn't need to give him anything?" Sarah said when he came back in, a thread of reproach hidden in her voice but softened by the dish in her hand. "It is not charity a town can't afford. Men think it's weakness." "Maybe it is," Jake said, "but it's a good kind." She nodded. "I'd rather be weak and keep a boy from going hungry than strong and keep my hands clean. There's a way a sentence like that sits between people and becomes a foundation." Jake did not know what to do with it exactly, so for a while he used the coin he found in his pockets to leave his own small gifts. A jar of sugar on Sarah's stoop, a wrapped cloth for cleaning, a new ribbon he found at the general store. He never said why. He was a man who could dig for months and not tell the depth of what he sought. The town took notice. Sharp-dressed men noted that he kept company with women of the saloon, and the small-town shamer, one Mrs. Cartwright, a tax of a woman who'd married a preacher and never forgiven him for not being the world, made a practice of pricking what she called bad examples. Mrs. Cartwright was the kind of person who felt the world owed her propriety and was willing to charge interest on it. She had a voice like sheared wool. It wrapped everything it touched in a moral sneer. She would stand by the saloon doorway, the hem of her white apron smelling faintly of starch, and make remarks loud enough for everyone to hear. She remarked that Sarah's dress didn't have the right hem for a woman of good standing. She remarked that she had seen men whisper with her behind the piano, and that discretion was a virtue the town sorely needed. Everyone heard, and everyone, in the small-town custom, looked away. Sarah's face tightened the way a bow does before it unleashes an arrow. She set the cups down gently and went on with her work. One dusty afternoon there was a festival at the county line. It was the sort of event that dresses up dirt and calls it glamour. Races that smelled of tack and horse sweat, a ring set for wrestling, and a small tent where a man with a painted beard sold fortune-telling scraps. The town came out in boots and hairspray. The men polished prices on their belts and the women adjusted airy collars as if that could hold the day together. Sarah had refused to go because to go was to be a spectacle, and she preferred to keep her feet on the ground. But when Ellen came and pinched her wrist with merciless affection and said, "Come on, girl. You work all the time," she went. There were a lot of eyes at festivals. They sharpen like knives when a crowd sells tickets. Sarah kept her head low and let others look up. She walked past stalls of ribbons and dry meat, past the ring where two strong men locked shoulders, their faces red with proud effort. People clapped. A man called down from a booth, asking if anyone wanted to test their strength on the post. The ringmaster's voice was sweet and sly. Sarah's face was a fern, quiet and turned aside. Jake had come for different reasons. A rumor of a strike on a claim out west had reached his ears, and the festival was a place to trade news, to catch a man at his leisure. He found Sarah near a game of horseshoes where a little boy had thrown the shoe too far, and it had landed at her boot. She bent to pick it up and in doing so brushed the hem of her skirt, and someone who thought themselves clever made a joke. "Apparently," said Mr. Harlan, a thin man with a ledger and a laugh like bad cutlery, "the only thing she's ever struck is a pot and a man's sense." Laughter corked the air. It wasn't ugly. It was small. It was the sort of laughter that makes a town feel right in its skin. Sarah's hand tightened around the shoe. Her face did not change. Jake saw her and felt something inside him go raw like an old bruise. He stepped forward as if pulled by a rope. "You mind?" he said, his voice low and even. There was a new kind of weight in it, a barge of something that had long been held under river water and now let loose, a simple claim. That word, that mockery, would not be allowed to stand. Mr. Harlan blinked as if surprised that the earth had answers returned. "Mind? Surely you jest," he said, peeling with a laugh that failed. "We're just having some fun." "Your fun makes her a target," Jake said, walking between the two men, not angry, just certain. The certainty in his gait was like a hand on the carving of a chair. It steadied the thing for a minute and made the shape of his interior clearer. The laughter slid into silence. The small town was a thing that had honed its reflexes to avoid real conflict. It preferred to let humiliation work in the quiet and call it justice. There were faces turned toward the ring, and in the pause everyone could feel the lift of something. Jake's voice was not a shout. It was a fixed, shallow drumbeat. It had the force of a man who'd been in trenches and knew the shape of quiet resolve. "You'll apologize," Jake said simply. Mr. Harlan looked around for an ally. "You're a stranger in our town," he said, cool as river bottom rock. "You don't get to tell our jokes." Jake's hands went to his belt in a way that suggested he would not back down. There's a difference between a man who reaches for a gun and a man who mentions it by what his hands do. The small town felt it as a tremor. Sarah watched them, her jaw unclenched. She felt ashamed in a way that curdled, not for herself but for the town that thought cruelty a pastime. She would have receded to the kitchen and let the men talk if not for Jake's deliberate steadfastness. Mr. Harlan's voice cracked like a whip. "Apologize for what?" he asked. He could see no wrong. Women like Sarah were meant to be the humble fixtures of a saloon, predictable and not too talkative. In Mr. Harlan's mind, that arrangement kept the town tidy. "Apologize for the cheap shot," Jake said. There was a rise of murmurs, a hum like a kettle about to boil. Then something happened that had the speed of a spark in dry grass. Jake reached out and took the shoe from Sarah's hands and tossed it back to the boy with the casualness of someone who'd been trained to conceal muscles that could otherwise refuse. It was a small movement but loaded, an action that claimed space for kindness and overturned expectation. Mr. Harlan's face did something ugly and perplexed, and he stepped back as if shoveled. "Well, that's not proper," he said, his voice thin. "Neither's using a woman's life for a laugh," Jake answered. The crowd shifted. A few men nodded as if agreeing with the weather. Mrs. Cartwright opened her mouth to lay down a sermon on decency, but the words found a different path and dried in her throat. The way Jake had acted was not a theft of pride but a restoration. People in Dry Creek found it easier to swallow quiet and compute their days than to act. But here, in the stretch of a festival, a man had used his presence to put a pin in the town's balloon of snideness. Sarah stood there like someone in a doorway where the light made the dust shine. She did not smile. She did not need to. But her eyes, those sharp, revered eyes, held something like gratitude. It was there and small and stubborn, the kind that did not depend on much. Jake, seeing it, felt a warmth creep under the skin he'd wrapped around himself for so long. That night the saloon hummed with tales of the festival. Men argued about gamblers' tricks and sinkholes, about the best brand of horse colts. Sarah moved through the room like a ghost of calm. Jake sat by the window and watched the road, though he had no idea where his road went. The town's small cruelty had been checked. For a moment something resembling civility returned. That evening, when the saloon emptied and the lamplight burned low and honey-colored, Jake stayed behind and offered Sarah a pocket-sized map he'd bought at the festival. A cheap, brightly colored thing that showed miners' claims and notations. He had doodled with a pencil on the margin a little sketch of two hands clasping. "For when you want to know there's others," he said in a soft voice. She accepted it with a nod. The map vanished into a drawer behind the bar where she kept little things she couldn't call hers and yet carried. For both of them there was an oddness. The feeling that small acts are sometimes all we are allowed before the world demands something louder. It was a beginning of sorts, a small exchange that had the gravity of two migrating birds planning a flight. Days grew into weeks with a slow patience like bread rising. The town aired its judgments and repairs itself daily. Jake found himself at the saloon more and more. He'd shout over a gambler at a table and tell the children a story about mountains that were like sleeping whales. He joined the men at dawn who went to the hills to prospect and returned with stories that smelled of stone and cold air. Sarah kept to the kitchen and the counter with a steady grace. Between them rose a new grammar of small gestures. Shared coffee, a hand offered for a heavy keg, a look exchanged over the ledger when someone insisted on paying with false compliments. The town watched and whispered. It always did. The shamer, Mrs. Cartwright, adjusted her moral ash until the town was smooth again. She said nothing to Jake directly, but she let the schoolteacher know that associating with a woman of the saloon was not wise, and soon the teacher tooted when Jake came by on his way to the consignment store to buy boots. It was the way small towns do battle. Not with blows but with the employment of shame and rumor. Sarah could have left. She could have taken the road like a thread gone. But she had learned to weave, and there were too many things to mend. The winter came early that year. The wind changed its voice and began to rattle the saloon doors like a man with a temper. Nights grew long and cold. The saloon's little stove complained and made its own noises, a sigh and a cough like somebody waking in the night. Hooks of frost patterned the windows. Sarah would wrap her hands on the steaming tin mug and feel the heat tattooed into her skin. Men paid with their breath and their stories and with a pocket full of hope that tomorrow the claim would spit up a seam of gold and change everything. Jake found his claim to the west in a squeeze of luck. A man at the county line had talked of a vein near a creek, a place that had the right geology for heartbreak and riches both. When a miner finds a vein that glitters, he is not as certain as he sounds. Gold is an erratic lover. Sometimes she takes what you offer, and sometimes she leaves your hands with the smell of something else. Jake went out with picks and a patience that felt almost prayerful. He worked the claim with a stubbornness that seemed bored with grandiosity and loved the mundane. The land was patient with him. It gave a vein, not a fortune, but enough to keep a light on. One night as seasons were changing their coat, word came to town. A rich strike had turned up further north. Men speculated about prospects and lies mingled with truth until neither could be separated. There was talk of fortunes and funerals both, such as the honest talk of miners. The saloon was a chorus of hope and caution. Mr. Harlan was the first to borrow Joe the blacksmith's voice and declare that fortunes shifted faster than a pair of boots. There were wagers. There were songs. Mrs. Cartwright, watching the wagons pass and the men go with their picks, felt something she could not name. She had a father who had come from the east and had the arrogance of land and name. She felt now like a small dog pacing the yard. She barked at the change because pesky changes made her nervous. When the wagons came back, they were loaded with new names, new faces, and with them often new cruel jokes. There was a man named Eli Morrow who came with the wagons, a drifter by trade, sharp of look and slick as oil. He carried a swagger as smooth as a polished stone and a grin meant to be disarming. He spoke like a man who owed the world little and expected added interest. He was the sort of man who smelled of opportunities and trouble in equal measure. He was the kind that kissed the town like a visitor kisses a hand, without intending to stay. The men in the saloon welcomed him because he could order a round and tell a story straight-faced and then ask for more. Eli looked at Sarah the way coyotes look at moonlight, hungry and impressed. To him she was fresh, someone who had arrived without the right sort of announcement. He liked to make a spectacle. He made wisecracks and watched for the small, certain blanch of a face. "Where you come from, girl?" he asked one night, in the way a dog circles a post. Sarah's jaw moved, slow as millstone. "From Days," she said. The answer was not a map, and he did not like that. He took to hovering near the door like someone who marks territory with a slow, oily patience. He spoke loud in a crowd, and his phrases were like bait. When tension roiled in small towns, men who were loud and sharp and without history to call on often earned sway. He began making murmurs, hints shaped like knives. He said she had the wrong sort of past. He suggested, with the smallness of a man who wants to unsettle others but not commit, that maybe she was not the sort to be trusted. Mrs. Cartwright, with her white starch and the smell of righteousness, heard him talk and nodded with the greed of a woman wanting a sermon. She joined in the chorus against Sarah in the soft way a frost joins a branch. It was not violent, only inevitable. People would nod and say that a woman like that had no claim to steadiness. They would tell tales that slid toward worse forms. Sarah heard them, and the shame of the town wrapped around her like a mantle. She had known of cruelty. She had met it with a stillness that read like prayer. But someone who woke old stories and placed them like a trap in the middle of the street had a different quality. And the town sometimes mistakes venom for truth. One afternoon, in a perfect convergence of wind and noise, Eli came forward with the smoothness of a man delivering news. He told a tale, thin as paper, saying that Sarah had been seen with a man at a mining camp out of town. "Seen with a man," he said, letting the words hang. Out of town, it was the sort of phrase that spreads like butter on bread that's already stale. A few men at the table snorted. A few women put down their cups. In Dry Creek, rumor was the water the town drank daily. The news reached Mrs. Cartwright like a lamp catches a breath. She walked into the saloon with a look like a sentence and placed her hand on Sarah's arm with a gentleness that made the saloon feel like an altar. "You weren't brought up right," she said loud enough for the room to hear. "There are standards." The room's temperature shifted. Eyes hungrily leaned on Sarah like a predator eyeing meat. The shame found its mark and began to gnaw at the edges. Sarah's shoulders didn't shift. She was used to being the object of other people's syllables, and she had learned that the only defense that never broke was stillness. She had not been with anyone other than the dead names that visited her in sleep. She had not given herself to rumor, and though she tried to explain that she had been trying to find work at a ranch out of town with her sister and had been refused, that this man was only an acquaintance from years before who had lent her money when hers had run out, her words were thin paper in a rain of accusation. The town wanted a show, and Mrs. Cartwright liked to be the director. "Shame," said Eli Morrow, with a soft smile like someone willing the window to break. The town's small cruelty rolled on like a wheel. They had a way of making a person's past a thing they held up like evidence on a rod. You could watch it in faces. The tilting of chin, the avoidance of eye contact, the way people folded their hands like small boats. Sarah stood as if made out of stone. Her heart beat behind ribstones like a creature in a cave. She did not lash out. She did not strike back with words. She used her quiet as a shield. That was her way. But men who taxed themselves with shaming never thought of the quiet person as someone with a thinness of support right behind the ribs. They assumed it an open field. Jacob saw it happen. He watched the room shift and knew, like any man who had carried his own shame, that whispers were a kind of violence. He stepped forward without thinking and said in a voice like a bell, "Enough." Mrs. Cartwright turned and fixed him with the stare of someone who always expects the world to agree with her. "And who might you be to decide when my tongue has gone too far?" she asked. "Someone who's seen what it does," Jacob answered. "We don't make sport of a woman because we don't like what we see." The room grew taut, like a violin string pulled too thin. Eli took this as a challenge, a chance to prove muscle. He stood and his grin widened like a crack. "You got something to say to me, stranger?" he asked. "I got something to say," Jacob replied. He approached Eli and the room's talk dimmed to near silence. There was the sound of a chair scraping. The wind outside picked at the drip rail and the saloon door sighed like a tired man. Jake's voice was low and controlled. "You leave her be." Eli laughed, high and bitter. "And you're going to make me?" The two men felt like two different kinds of weather meeting at a fence. Jake stood like a presence in a room that had not expected one. Eli moved with a quickness that suggested he was used to letting a grin be his sword. For a moment the saloon held its breath. Someone might have called for reason and gotten away with it. But in Dry Creek men had a fondness for scratches and scars. They liked to pretend that they were carved from oak rather than flesh. Eli moved forward and slapped Jake. It was a false move meant to anger instead of bruise. The slap landed with a crack that rung like a phrase in the hush. Jake's face did not flare. He took the slap as if it were a heavy thing people must bear on account of their pride. He could have struck back, and perhaps a town would have expected it. Instead he reached for Eli's wrist, not to crush but to steady the hand that had made the gesture. Eli's eyes widened with surprise because his move had been intended to show that he, not Jake, had the power to provoke. He hadn't expected restraint. "You don't get to do that to a woman," Jake said, voice soft but leveled. "And you best not be teaching the men of this town to think it's funny." That was the point where the saloon held itself like a wound. Men realized they were being told they had been playing at cruelty. It landed with the texture of a sermon in a church that hadn't had one in a long while. The electricness of his words set a new edge in the air, and for a moment the town trembled. Eli had a temper, but he also had the cunning of a man who knows when to bend. He chose to laugh and call Jake a fool for being worthy of their laughter. He called Sarah everything he wished to hide in himself, and the room responded with the small sounds of those committed to a social order that rewarded mockery. But Jake's voice was a thing that didn't ask for permission. He kept it contained and dangerous. "You step over that line again," he said. "And you owe this town more than a whiskey." Eli scoffed and walked out, his back tight as a hinge. The men found their old voices again, and the saloon resumed a semblance of the night's earlier mirth. Yet the air in the place had been changed slightly. The next day's gossip would have a new angle, that a stranger had stood up for a woman. For Sarah, who had been the butt of the town's jokes for so long, it felt like an unfamiliar rain. The days after, she noticed small things. Jake started arriving at the saloon before dawn sometimes, and he would disappear with a basket of warm rolls for the women who washed and a jar of preserves for Ellen. His eyes sought her not always to speak but to anchor, and she started to set a pot to boil earlier than usual so that she could see him come in and exchange the odd, careful word. He told short stories of the mountain and of tunnels where the rock shone like a hidden truth, and she nodded like a navigator who knows the names of constellations. There were other trials. Eli began to spread other rumors, like a man trailing torn flyers. He told tales of theft and small crimes, the sort that can haunt a woman whose life is already weighted. The town took the stories with the hungry interest of a dog who hears a rabbit. Sarah's plates started coming back with crumbs gone, and her tips grew small like warmed over measures. She ate at the stove when she could and did not throw the pot. Shame is a thing that can be made public and private at the same time. Then, on a winter night that held the world like a white fist, a man came to the saloon, meaner and shriller than Eli, smelling of the road and bad intentions. He had a voice that sounded like the wrong side of a corduroy. He had money in his pocket and a taste for trouble in his throat. He came for a fight and to make sure that anyone who looked different enough to be an easy mark got their due. He took his stand across from Sarah like a dog in a bad mood. "You sure got a lot of nerve coming into our town, girl," he said, leaning in like temptation. His hand reached for Sarah's arm and she felt it like cold iron. His fingers closed, not cruelly, but in a way that assumed the world belonged to him. Sarah's hands were busy over a dish. She tried to pull back. The man's grip tightened and he said something cruel and loud, a phrase meant to flatten her. Jake saw the contact like a flare. He stood and moved through the saloon the way a man walks when a bear has spoken, direct, with the knowledge that hesitation might cost him his life. He put himself between the man and Sarah, voice low and dangerous. "Leave her be," he said. The man laughed. He had the swagger of someone used to winning arguments with property and fists. "Or what?" he asked. "You gonna make me?" Jake didn't answer with a bluster. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the man's arm in a careful, steadying way, a touch that said he recognized the man's hunger but would not be taken in by it. There was a silence in the saloon like the pause before a departing train. Everyone knew some fights were expensive and not worth it. The man moved his hand away. His excuse was the same as Eli's had been before. He'd been drunk on the sound of his own voice and meant nothing by it. But late that night men walked out with less swagger than before. Here, finally, was a kind of justice that didn't ask for applause. Sarah, in the days after, was silent in a way that held both the memory of her shaking arm and the comfort of a man who had stepped to be a shield. She did not speak much because words seemed like small boats on a river that would not take them. But she watched Jacob with a new edge in her gaze that asked questions and wasn't sure she was ready to answer them. He did not hurry. He never promised anything like the moon. He moved with a stubborn patience that was the mark of a man who'd been caught in flash floods and survived. He complimented her pie once, in a way that was clumsy as a man trying to say grace. "That's the best molasses I've tasted," he said. For him it was honest. For her it was like being given a star. There was an old willow by the river out of town, its branches long and soft like a woman's hair. It was the sort of place where secrets could be left and maybe not found. That's where Jake took her one afternoon when the sun was shallow and the town felt like an afternote. He brought a small pack and a thermos of coffee. Sarah refused at first, but then, for reasons she did not know, she accepted. They sat in the shade and watched the river move with the endless devotion of a lover who had nowhere to go but on. "You ever been mining?" she asked, because she liked to ask the things that bobbed in the dark. Jake smiled a little. "A little. I used to move rocks for a living," he said. "Now I move them for an answer." "Answers are not always clean," she said. Her hand closed around the mug like a bird. "They sometimes look like work." He nodded and looked at the river like it might hand him the map. "I know a man who talks like he has an answer, and then the ground slips away." He brushed the hair from his face with a slow motion. "Used to have a photograph I kept. Now it's all a little faded. But I remember shapes. I remember things." "You look at the sky a lot," she said. He laughed softly. "I look where I'm going." There was more in her silence than in his words. They sat a long while without press. It was a companionship like two hands on a harness, a mutual hold against a weight neither needed to name. When the sun shifted its angle and the willow breathed, they walked back into town in silence. The town was waiting. That's what towns do. They measure what they can with the smallest ruler. The shamer continued. Eli kept his whispers like a man hoarding bread. He chewed small portions of gossip and spat them onto the street so their taste lingered. Mrs. Cartwright found an ally in the preacher who liked the way a parish walked in ordered rows. The town's machinery whirred. It polished the small disgraces and sold them to one another. Sarah's heart was a stubborn animal that knew how to guard and how to give. She kept the map Jake had given her tucked away. She found herself looking at the writing along the marge and thinking of the two hands sketched there. For a moment, sometimes at dusk, the notion of belonging felt possible. Jacob, too, found himself thinking of a kind of redemption that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with standing beside someone and taking the insult for them. There are times when a man sees what the world has done to a person and decides to stand as if the world were slightly off-kilter. That was Jake. He stood because he could not, in good conscience, let cruelty pass as property. One spring day, the river swelled from a storm out in the far hills. Came fast and angry like a thing that had deep reasons. People had expected the sluice and so prepared. But the storm was bigger than the route they'd planned for it to take. The bridge over the dry creek, a neat construction of wood and pride, sagged under the weight of water and a homestead wagon overturned below. A boy, no older than the one whose shoe had been tossed, shouted for help from the bank where the current threatened to take him. Jake was the first to move. He ran to the bridge and slipped on the wet wood but did not fall. He leaned over the railing and took the rope and swung it like a man who had been taught the geometry of rescue. His hands were calm and quick. Sarah had come up behind him with the rest of the town and watched with the kind of terror that knows how to pray without naming the deity its prayers hope to reach. The boy was snatched up and carried to the shore with the sort of gentleness that made the town add a notch in its ledger of what it owed to strangers and friends. For once the town's small cruel stories were pushed aside by a river's roar and a man's steady hand. After the rescue, the town's talk turned. "He saved the kid," murmured Mrs. Cartwright, and in her voice there was a rustle that suggested change might not be entirely unwelcome. She felt a small pinch. People are often humbled by acts that force them to speak of heroism, even their own forced ones. The world is made of small switches that interrupt a life's dark runs. There was a letter that found Sarah not long after. A simple worn envelope that held a slip of paper with the name her mother had given and a note with the first line, "You remember your bones." It had been sent from a place she had left years ago. It said little more than that her grandmother had passed and there would be a gathering. It did not instruct a woman to return, but it did say that someone was waiting to fold her into the old world. The letter handed her a choice like a knife with two handles. She could stay in Dry Creek and continue weaving a life that had been given to her by accident and resilience. Or she could go back, reclaim old names and duties, and perhaps answer a past she had left to breathe. She told no one for a while. The town noticed the absence of her step in the saloon and asked questions that were never meant to be gentle. Mrs. Cartwright took it as an opportunity to spread theories of moral cloud and omen. Jake, upon learning, packed a small bag and offered to escort her part of the way with the look of a man who had been given permission to be protective, which in small towns is often confused with the license to claim. Sarah said nothing for a time. She had learned that the best answers were sometimes smaller than breath. She told him she would go and he offered a ride. The morning they left, the town hovered. People came to the dusty edge as if to see a bird fly. Mrs. Cartwright made the crossing as if to cast a last glance. There was a line of things unsaid between Sarah and Jake that stood like a fence. He had been watching her for so long that when he took her hand at the wagon step, it was not fancied. There was a soft assertion in his fingers that said he would be there even if the road offered nothing but stones. Her hand fit his in a way that felt right, like two things finding each other after the tide had pulled them wide. In the silence of the wagon, with the town dwindling into a row of houses behind them, they spoke small pieces. "I'd go with you," Jake told her, "if you'd let me." She studied his face in the way one studies a map. "I don't know where that road goes," she said. "Sometimes that's the best sort," he said. "It means you travel it and make it your own." She looked at him for a long while then. Her face held the stone of someone who had decided. "I have a grandmother," she said. "She needs me." Jake nodded. He had his own secrets that liked to remain secret. "I'll walk a ways with you," he said. "And then I'll head back here. I got work I can't leave." They rode in a wagon that smelled of leather and hay, the air cold with the edge of spring. The prairie rolled by like unrolling cloth. They spoke of small, ordinary things. The way horses dislike the whisper of certain grasses, the color of the sky when rain is due, the cadence of a lullaby Sarah's mother had hummed. Bonds are often made in the ordinary. When they stopped at a small town for the night, Sarah said she would see her grandmother and then perhaps travel on. "Maybe," she said, the word a slender reed, "I'll come back." Jake did not press. He did not make vows. Instead, he shared a bowl of stew and wrapped an extra blanket around her shoulders in a way that felt like a promise. She slept with the map in her hand that night, the map with a doodled sketch of two hands. It felt less like a thing and more like the idea of a future. At the gathering for her grandmother, Sarah stepped into a room filled with people who remembered her as a child. There were stories of the old days. The way the land smelled when rain came, the names of rivers, the old songs her grandmother used to hum. They spoke to Sarah in a way the town had never learned to speak. Direct, loving, and lit with an old patience. Her grandmother's house was filled with the smell of cedar and the soft scent of sage. They fed her, spoke, and placed a small bundle with a beadwork sash into her hands. It was a thing to carry like a prayer. For the first time in years, she was seen in a way that reflected something of her true name. Jake went back to Dry Creek with a promise that sounded quiet but true. He would wait. He came back with the air of someone who had been given permission to hope. He had done the thing of holding the line. In a town that traded insults like coin, he had stood. It was perhaps a small revolution, but revolutions are often made of many small acts. Months passed. The seasons folded themselves like paper. Sarah returned to Dry Creek with a steadier step and a beadwork sash that made the saloon counter brighter. The town noticed her with a new look that mixed curiosity with the faint odor of respect. Mrs. Cartwright found fewer mouths to feed with her sharp words. Her soap felt a little less sweet. Eli Morrow had left town for reasons he'd never explain. Some men are like storms. They come and then they move on when the weather turns. Jake and Sarah found ways to share their days. He would bring a handful of mica stones to show her the glitter inside the rock. She would set a pot on the stove when he came in, and they would sit and eat without fuss, enjoying the small miracle of a meal that was steady and true. There was a quiet between them that held more than words. People in the saloon would watch them and say, in the back of their throats, that it was good to see two steady things in a town that liked bright but dangerous lights. Sarah did not wear her past like a badge. She carried it like a pocket-sized stone. Always there, unassuming, heavy when picked up. Her Apache grandmother's teachings were like a lamp that burned soft. Look straight, honor the earth, speak only when it helps. Jake, for his part, kept his tools and his photograph folded in a pocket. He'd take out the photograph at times when the night felt bare and place it near the stove to warm. Sometimes he would tell Sarah of a river far away with stones that shone like fish scales and a woman whose laugh had the courage of twilight. He spoke of the times when he had to do small bad things to survive. He told her his past like someone who gave confessions without asking for absolution. Sarah listened like someone who takes in rain. The town's animosity softened into a sort of embarrassed acceptance. People learned that Sarah's hands were steady and her heart larger than their petty measures. Men who had once mocked her would now ask for a cup of her stew as if they were buying back a small piece of their own conscience. Children who had once pushed her away now came and curled at her feet and asked for stories. There was a night that had the feel of something remembered long after the world has cooled. Jake and Sarah walked the line of town under lamplight, the sky pinched with stars. A man called out a greeting that carried the warmth of a newfound respect. The small-town shamer sat on her porch, the starch still proud in her collar, and watched these two carry on like a pair of geese that had finally found a pattern. There was a hush in the street, like a moment of prayer. Jake didn't shout. He didn't make a big declaration. He took Sarah's hand at the door of the saloon and said, in the kind of voice that has learned the measure of things, "You ever think of staying?" She looked at him, the way someone reads a line in a book where they had been lost before. "I didn't know staying could look like that," she said simply. He smiled, a small, honest trade. "I reckon it can," he said. The saloon held the chorus of small lights, and the floorboards creaked in their familiar voices, like old friends telling secrets. The town changed in the ways that small places do, slowly and with a lot of forgetting. The shamer grew older and found fewer people who valued her sermons. The saloon stayed where it was, its door creaking in the same old rhythms and the piano playing the same tired tunes. Sarah kept the counter clean and the coffee hot. Jake kept working the mines in the way men of his sort do, steady, patient, and sometimes lucky. Sometimes he came home with a glint of something that kept them well-fed for a week, and sometimes he came with empty pockets and a head full of plans. They learned to step together through the small trials of weather and gossip and common failures. There were nights when they sat on the porch and listened to the world exhale. Sarah would place her head on Jake's shoulder, and he would rotate his hat by the brim like a man who measures relief. He would tell her about his work, about the tunnels, the water, the way the rock carries its own voice. She would tell him about the old songs, about beadwork and the names of the moons her grandmother had given. They did not always speak. Sometimes they simply sat and watched the world fold up its day. Evenings came round like patience, and sometimes Sarah would collar the children that leaned near the saloon doorway and tell them stories. They listened, the kids, because there was realness in a woman who had seen much. Sarah spoke of the river, of the women her grandmother had known, of the trick of threading a bead so small the eye hardly notices, and in those stories the children found a bigger sky. The town learned to look in richer ways. Time has a way of softening stones into river rock. Years passed, and the town grew none the less human but more patient. Jake and Sarah made a life in small ways. The planting of a garden behind the saloon, the repair of a fence, the paying of a repair bill for an old carpenter who had once been too proud to ask. They learned the forgiveness the town could afford, not always generous but steady. The climax came, as such things do, not as a gesture but as a fact. It happened one summer when the town's water ran thin and tempers were thin with it. Eli Morrow's shadow returned in the form of a man with land and the intention to buy a claim on the edge of Dry Creek. He'd made his way back with claims that were sharper than a knife and a desire for business. He said there were veins that could be opened and cities that could be built. The town listened. For a time he had a pull like a man with silver buttons. But old reputations do not forget. When his talk turned to greed and his talk to buying up what he could and selling it to the highest bidder, the town grew suspicious. A meeting was called at the hall. Eli's veneer cracked when men with a long memory questioned his claims. He raised his voice and the meeting became heated. Mrs. Cartwright, who had borne plenty of small tastes of humiliation, sat with a look that said she was learning a new grammar of pride. Eli, in a last act of self-importance, tried to force a claim. He wandered the outskirts and began to stake out rights on property that the town had used for years. He started to call the miners liars and imply that he could buy up what they had. It is one thing to trade words in a saloon and another thing to threaten the livelihood of a town. A line was crossed. There was a day, then, when Eli walked up to Sarah, the one who had once been his show in the saloon, and spat his contempt. The town held its breath. But Jake stepped up like he always did and said, simply, "You got no right." Eli swung a fist and in the scuffle made a move that would have cost someone else. The town watched as he fell into the ditch of his own making. Men helped him up. There was no desire for blood in the place. Eli's swagger was broken, his mean-lipped laugh a little thin. People cheered for the miners and for the town that had shut down a bully. It was not a grand victory. It was the small kind. The town had finally learned to assemble around more than rumor. In the end, Eli left town with his pockets lighter and his temper more brittle. The town sighed in relief like a man who had set down a sack of stones. They would not forget his cruelty, but they had found better ways to remove it. And then, in the tender, inevitable way of smaller worlds, things settled. There was a harvest that came and the scent of bread in the saloon. And the saloon's doors creaked less with the weight of secrets and more with the ease of business. Sarah and Jake walked together through seasons, making their home in the saloon's back room and planting the odd row of beans in the garden. They learned that vows need not be loud to be true. They did not marry with a great crowd. They made vows like two people who understood the shape of what they'd lost and what they still had the right to ask. Small, honest promises, a nod of two hands and the sharing of bread. The town changed, then, in small ways. People who once had scorned hands learned the meaning of steady labor. Mrs. Cartwright grew more tolerant in the same way a stone grows moss. She did not change so much as the world softened her edges with time. The saloon's piano played a little softer, and Faye the piano woman learned new songs about forgiveness. The town's children grew up with stories where a woman was more than a joke and a man was more than his size. The gossip continued, as gossip does, but it had lost its bite. Years later, sitting on the porch one evening with the air warm and the stars a net of small points, Jake looked at Sarah and said, without the fanfare of intent, "You know what you did? You taught me the shape of staying." She took his hand and squeezed it in a way that said she recognized the thing inside him she loved. "And what you did was teach me the shape of being defended," she said, smiling a little, the way someone smiles when the past has been made softer by being seen. They held each other and watched the town move in its small rhythms. People walked by and tipped a hat. Mrs. Cartwright, older and softened, passed on and someone marked her with a quiet memorial. A wreath of ribbon and burned frankincense placed in the church window. Men who had once mocked Sarah came to tell her they were sorry in ways that were clumsy but honest. It mattered. In small towns, apologies are seeds and sometimes they flower. When the winter rain came deep again and the river rose like a memory, the town moved as if practiced. Men who could not swim learned to roll a barrel and secure a line. The children learned the songs of the old creek bed and the way the world keeps giving and taking. Sarah and Jake, older now, still walked with a steady step. They had a small home with a garden and a chest where they kept the small treasures of their life. A map with doodles and 2 polished stones, a beadwork sash, a photograph and a pocket watch whose hands sometimes stuck in the cold. They spoke less and loved more in the way long marriages do, by remembering each other's small quirks and leaving more room for the other's grief. They did not have riches. They had something better. A town that had learned to be kinder in the face of simple cruelty. A place where a woman who was once talked about had become a person whose counsel people sought when the cattle were stray or the schoolteacher needed an extra hand. In the end, it was not a monumental scene that sealed their story but a simple confession by a man who had been a miner and a protector. One late afternoon, as the sun dropped like a coin into the horizon, Jake took Sarah's hands in both of his, the skin of their palms a map of years. "You ever think," he said in the way men who have been shaped by suffering speak their soft things, "that a kiss from you is worth more than any gold I could ever strike?" Sarah's eyes, still bright, still reserved, met his and the world shrank to the space between the two of them. Her lips curved just enough to let him know she had kept pieces of him safe in the folds of her heart. "That's the richest thing I've ever heard," she said, in her careful, truthful way. They did not marry with fanfare. The town knew well enough that a life is less about silver-bowed promises and more about the daily acts that keep hunger at bay and song in the air. They had their small ceremony at the church with only the nearest neighbors and the children Sarah had told stories to over the years as witnesses. Mrs. Cartwright, a grudging elder of the community, sat in the back and, in the silence, allowed herself a softening that might have passed for blessing. They lived out their days in a measured tenderness. Jake found a vein that sometimes fed the household and sometimes didn't. Sarah continued to run the saloon with a steady hand and a heart unredressed by the old shame. The town's old cruelty diminished, not entirely erased but softened by the presence of two people who bore their life with an unvarnished dignity. They learned to love each other not in the way novels make it grand, but in the way a hand brushes hair from the face of a sleeping beloved, in the way a pot is set on the table at the right time. There were nights when Jake would hum the fragile song of the river and Sarah would stitch beadwork into new patterns that told the story of their seasons. There were times when the remnant of old rumors would ski across town and die quiet and ashamed. Their life was not the end of the world's cruelties, but it was an argument against them, persistent and patient. When the end came, as ends do, it was quiet, like the closing of a well-read book. Jake died in the mild month of October with Sarah holding his hand and the saloon's door open to the fields. He passed with the satisfaction of one who had lived true. Sarah mourned with a grief that was honest and not vain. She kept his photograph against the stove and placed small stones at his grave, the way his people and hers had taught them. For a time she felt the ache of a missing word. But the town rallied. They built a marker and gathered to tell stories about the man who had stood. Months later, Sarah sat at the saloon's counter and watched the light spill across the floorboards. She had lived enough to know that every kindness ratifies itself in others and that one small courage could change a town. She ran her hand over the map he had given her and touched the doodle of two hands. The saloon's piano hummed in the corner like a secret. People came in, neighbors with little bits to say, and she listened, and sometimes she told the stories of the river and the man who loved small things. If someone came into the saloon with a look of hunger or grief, she held a silver cup out like a lifeline. She had learned how to do this through the years, to be a harbor, a person who refuses to let cruelty be the town's compass. And that's how a whisper changed a town. If her story hit you hard, don't forget the ones who stay quiet. She gave everything without asking. And finally, someone gave back. For more tales of dusty hearts and clean redemption, hit subscribe, partner.